Hello everyone, I'm Mitzahon, and Full Set Limited Review Week for Core Set 2019 is currently in motion here on my channel. So far I've covered all the cards in white, black, and blue. Today we're looking at red, tomorrow we'll look at green, and so on. In these videos I use a letter grade system to tell you just how good I think these cards will be in Limited. If you want more information on how I grade these cards, you can find a link in the description below. Let's go ahead and get started with the first red card in Core Set 2019, which is Act of Treason, which costs 2 generic and a red. It's a common sorcery. It says, gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature. It gains haste until end of turn. This card's always interesting. In most cases in the past when it's printed, it is commonly one of the last cards in packs during the draft, but I don't think it's unplayable. It just isn't great. It can be good in a couple scenarios. One of them is your deck is incredibly aggressive, and Act of Treason can consistently end games for you by getting your opponent's best blocker and attacker out of the way and then attacking them with it along with all your creatures. The other is that you have sacrifice outlets that let you actually kill your opponent's creature in addition to stealing it. The black-red deck in this format is going to be particularly adept at doing that. I think if you're just an aggro deck, this is probably a D+ or so. It's kind of the card that you'll play as a 23rd card or whatever. But in a deck that has a sufficient number of cards that like to sacrifice stuff, I think it firmly moves up to a C. Next we have Alpine Moon, which for 1 red mana is a rare enchantment, and it says, as it enters the battlefield, choose a non-basic land card name. Lands your opponent's control with the chosen name lose all land types and abilities, and they gain tap, add 1 mana of any color. This wasn't printed for Limited. It is printed to hold down the flip lands in Standard and Tron lands in non-rotating formats. It will basically do nothing in this Limited format other than upgrade your opponent's lands, and for that reason it's deserving of an F in Limited. Next we have Apex of Power, which for 7 generic and 3 red is a mythic sorcery. It says exile the top 7 cards of your library until end of turn. You may cast non-land cards exiled this way. If this spell was cast from your hand, add 10 mana of any one color. This card's cool, but I don't think it's especially good in Limited. 10 mana should end a game, and this won't do that consistently enough. It's too random. Sure, 7 cards is a huge percentage of your deck in Limited, but on average, like 3 of those are going to be lands. Maybe you get 4 other spells, but you can't even cast all of them because the card still makes you pay their mana costs. Sure, it gives you 10 mana back, but still. Maybe it will prove me wrong, but I just don't imagine this working out very well between costing 10 and being inconsistent, and as a result, I think it's another F. Next we have Banefire, which is a rare sorcery that costs X and a red. It does X damage to any target, and if X is 5 or more, this spell can't be countered, and the damage can't be prevented. X burn spells are excellent in Limited. They scale as the game goes on, unlike most red removal spells, meaning this can kill pretty much anything. It can also go to the dome to end the game when necessary. This is something you first pick most of the time when you see it, and I'm giving it an A-. Next we have Boggart Brute, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 Goblin Warrior at common, and it has Menace. We had this in our last core set, Magic Origins, and it was a pretty nice common there. The format was an incredibly aggressive one, and he helped make it that way. A 3 mana 3/2 Menace is just a really good rate. Menace creatures are extra good in super aggressive decks, interested in running both combat tricks and auras, because those things create problems for your opponent since they have to double block the guy. He's a C+. Next we have Catalyst Elemental, which is 2 generic and a red for a 2/2 elemental at common, and you can sacrifice it to add 2 red mana to your mana pool. A 3 mana 2/2 that can sacrifice for 2 red seems pretty okay to me. It can help you cast bigger creatures and spells, and that's nice, but I don't think this is anything special. We've seen similar effects in the past be kind of underwhelming, like Generator Servant and Skirk Prospector. You'll play 1 or 2 in most red decks and never be thrilled about it. Sometimes it will ramp you into a bomb, and that'll be great. I'll give it a C. Next we have Crash Through, which for 1 red mana is a common sorcery that says creatures you control gain trample until end of turn, draw a card. So this is a recent reprint, and it's red's obligatory spell that almost doesn't do anything other than drawing you a card. Sometimes a trample will matter, especially if you have big creatures, but mostly this is here for spells matter purposes and to basically cycle. It's a D, you'll cut it for most decks. Next we have Dark Dweller Oracle, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 Goblin Shaman at rare. You can pay 1 and sacrifice a creature to exile the top card of your library, and you may play that card this turn. So this is a 2 mana 2/2 with serious upside. Red's pseudo card draw effect is always kind of fun, and this is the most powerful version of it because you can even play lands off of this. Some of these effects, when we see them, don't let you play lands, and that can be a little frustrating. It has a really low mana cost to use the effect too, so you have a good shot to actually be able to play whatever you reveal. In a worst case scenario, this can also sacrifice itself for the effect. It gets really nasty though when you bring in creature tokens, or creatures that your opponent targets with removal, or your opponent's creature that you use Act of Treason on and you sacrifice it. It kind of incentivizes your opponent to cast removal on their own turn in a weird way, since if you reveal anything that isn't an instant, you won't get to use it. Making your opponent do it on their own turn is pretty nice, I think, especially with the additional upside here. Still, it does require some setup, but it is a pretty nice red card that can grind you out a win, and that's not always something red decks are capable of. I think you first pick this in some weaker packs. I think it's a B-. Next we have Demanding Dragon, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 5/5 dragon at rare with flying, and when it enters the battlefield it does 5 damage to target opponent unless that player sacrifices a creature. So a 5-mana 5/5 flyer is already like a B, probably, may even be a B+, because that's ridiculous stats you just don't see very often in Limited, at least at lower rarities. Sometimes you do see it at rare like we do here. And this comes with some upside. I don't normally like effects that give my opponent a choice, since obviously they will choose whichever is the least impactful. But when that sort of effect is attached to an efficient flyer, it doesn't really matter. I think if you're playing a 5-mana 5/5 flyer and your opponent either decides to take 5 or sacrifice a creature, you're going to feel pretty good about this. This is a great first pick, and I'm giving it an A-. Next we have Dismissive Pyromancer, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 human wizard at rare. You can pay 1 red mana and tap it to discard a card and draw a card, rummaging as we call it. And for 2 generic and a red, you can tap it and sacrifice it to do 4 damage to target creature. This is my kind of 2-drop. Decent stats and 2 strong activated abilities. One lets you rummage, and the other lets you kill something at instant speed. If it is allowed to stay in play, it will have a Merfolk Looter style effect on the game, and in a pinch can be a removal spell, and I like both of those things a lot. He's a solid B that you'll first pick in most packs. Next we have Double Cast, which is 2 red mana for an uncommon sorcery that says, whenever you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. This card has powerful potential, but you need a ton of instants and sorceries in your deck to consider running it. Your average Limited deck has like 3 or 4, and if that's what you have, you probably shouldn't run this, because it is utterly useless unless you also have an instant or sorcery. If you're getting closer to 7, or even better closer to 10, then this can be nice, but honestly it still isn't anything crazy. I mean, you basically get to convert a card in your hand into whatever your next instant or sorcery is. Ideally, you're copying like a removal spell or draw spell with it, and that will give you the kind of value you need. But this is basically an F in your typical Limited deck, and probably a C+ in the blue-red Spells Matter deck if you get there on spells. Next, we have Dragon Egg, which is 2 generic and a red for an uncommon Dragon Egg, who is a 0/2. He has Defender, and when it dies, you create a 2/2 red dragon creature token with flying, and pay 1 red. This creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So this card's main purpose is to serve as sacrifice fodder. We've already seen a few cards that want you to sacrifice stuff. Black-red is most interested in sacrificing of all the color pairs, and this will really shine there, as obviously sacrificing this is actually a good thing, as you get a much better creature. It still isn't a bad card in a regular deck, just because opponents have to attack at some point, and being able to block and get a threatening flyer in the air doesn't hurt. But I think it's probably still just a C overall. Next we have Electrify, which for 3 generic and a red is an instant at common, and it does 4 damage to target creature. Last time we saw this, it underperformed a little bit. This is because Amonkhet was a crazy aggressive set, and you ended up killing 2 or 3 mana creatures with this, and that didn't feel too great since your opponent was coming out ahead mana-wise so often. It was still good, don't get me wrong, but it was more like a C+ in that format. I think in most formats, though, this gets into the B range, meaning you want to first pick it a lot of the time, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next we have Fiery Finish, which for 4 generic and 2 red is an uncommon sorcery that says, Fiery Finish deals 7 damage to target creature. It's kind of a weird card to me. I keep looking at it and thinking it must do something other than 7 damage, and I guess I'm just greedy, because 7 damage is obviously a lot, enough to take down most creatures. But if this format proves to be fast, this is going to be some super clunky removal. I think I'm still obligated to start it in the B range, because in most formats it will be good enough, but man, 6 mana at sorcery speed can be ugly sometimes. Next we have Fire Elemental, which is 3 generic and 2 red for a 5/4 elemental at common. That's it. We just saw this in Dominaria where it was like a D+. That's what it is in most limited formats, just because those stats aren't especially good for the cost, and you only play it when really lacking in the creature department. So it will get a D+. Next we have Goblin Instigator, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/1 Goblin Rogue at common, and when it enters the battlefield it creates a 1/1 red Goblin creature token. So I think this is basically a better Dragon Fodder or Krenko's Command. I think it's better because if you can find a way to do it, you can abuse the Into the Battlefield trigger on this to get more goblins. You can't do that with Krenko's Command and the like. Either way, though, this card's good. As a 2-drop that brings you 2 bodies, it is good at basically all stages. It also provides sacrifice fodder for the red-black deck. I'm going to give it a C+. It's a pretty good common. Next we have Goblin Motivator, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Goblin Warrior at common, and you can tap it to give a creature haste until end of turn. We have seen many an incarnation of this card, and I'm never really that into it. Sure, in your really aggressive deck, maybe it'll be okay, but I just don't feel like it does enough in most situations to be good enough. Haste isn't as good as some other keyword abilities because it is basically only good if you're already ahead. If there is a board stall where you're behind, you can't attack anyway. I'm giving this a D+. Next, we have Goblin Trashmaster, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a rare Goblin Warrior, and it's a 3/3. It's a Goblin Lord, pumps all other goblins +1/+1, and you can sacrifice a goblin to destroy an artifact. So at worst, this is a 4-mana 3/3 that can blow up an artifact when necessary. That's serviceable, and I think the floor on this is actually playable, like a C-, not like something you're really excited about. But, you know, a 4-mana 3/3 that you can cash in to blow up an artifact at some point is a playable card. The more goblins you get, though, the better he gets, and there are enough goblins in this set that you can sometimes do impressive things. There are 5 at common or uncommon, and that's a decent number. Getting more than 5 in a draft might be pushing it, but you might be able to pull it off. I think this is a B- in a deck with around 5 goblins in it. It definitely isn't worth first picking, but if you see one and look down and already have several goblins, probably time to pull the trigger on the Trashmaster. Next, we have Gutter Snipe, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 Goblin Shaman at uncommon, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. Obviously enough, this is a build-around. One that will pan out most frequently in blue-red, and probably the next most frequently in red-black. A 3-mana 2/2 isn't good, but making every single instant or sorcery spell you play do 2 to the opponent is great. I think an average limited deck probably has 3 to 5 of those, just normally, and he's probably like a D in that deck. But if you manage to get a lot of spells in your deck, he can be as good as a B-. Next, we have Havoc Devils, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/3 devil at common, and it has trample. There was a time when Summit Prowler was actually a solid card, like a C, a 4-mana 4/3 with no text, basically. And creature power creep is very real because we have the same thing here, but trample added to it. And that's pretty nice. Those are some nice stats for a 4-mana plus the keyword ability. You know, I think this is a solid 4-drop for any deck in red, and I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Hostile Minotaur, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/3 Minotaur at common, and it has haste. Decent stats here. Going to be a fine 4-drop for red decks, and there's not really much more to say about it. I think it's a solid C. Next, we have Inferno Hellion, which for 3 generic and a red is a Hellion at uncommon. It's a 7/3 with trample, and it says at the beginning of each instep, if Inferno Hellion attacked or blocked this turn, its owner shuffles it into their library. Mostly, I don't love this. It's basically a better Lava Axe. It isn't going to be very good in any deck that isn't ultra aggressive, and even then, it only gets in for 1 shot of 7 and disappears. And sure, 7 is a lot, but it is basically only worth it if it is going to kill or almost kill your opponent. So if you're a hyper-aggressive deck of some kind, play this by all means. But if you're doing anything else, you probably shouldn't play it. I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Lathless Dragon Queen, which is 4 generic and 2 red for a 6/6 legendary dragon at rare. She has flying. Whenever another non-token dragon enters the battlefield under your control, she makes a 5/5 red dragon creature token with flying, and she has a powerful activated ability where for 1 generic and a red, dragons you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. I'm always going to sign up for a 6-mana 6/6 flyer. Those stats alone would get a card into the B range, but this comes with an activated ability that at minimum lets you pump her, and means you can swing for 9 with her, at least on her first attack. I'm going to give this a build-around grade, even though it is already insane with 0 other dragons. I think it's an A- in your typical limited deck, just because of its evasiveness and size. In a deck that has a few dragons in it, well, she becomes completely insane, and is probably something like an A+. Next, we have Lava Axe, which for 4 generic and a red is a common sorcery, does 5 damage to target player or planeswalker. I'm not usually interested in this card. Sure, it can give your aggro deck some reach, but this card is automatic card disadvantage, and that's a good way to lose in limited. In other words, it doesn't impact the board at all, and is basically only good if it kills your opponent, which it just won't do often enough to make up for the other times where it is an utterly useless sorcery that costs 5 mana. I'm going to give it an F. It's even worse than the Hellion I compared to the Axe, because the Hellion hits harder for less mana and shuffles itself back into your library. Next up, we have Lightning Mare, which for 2 red mana is an uncommon elemental horse. It's a 3/1, it can't be countered, can't be blocked by blue creatures, and for 1 generic and a red, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. This isn't the most exciting part of the Mare cycle. Lightning Mare really needs your opponent to have blue creatures to be at its best. A 2-mana 3/1 can definitely hit hard early, and the Fire Breathing lets it hit even harder, but it gets killed by basically anything. Any chump block, any removal spell. It's a fine 2-drop you'll play in your aggressive red decks, but I think it's just a solid C. Next, we have Lightning Strike, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant that does 3 damage to any target. This is premium removal and is going to be first pickable in most packs. Instant speed, 2 mana for 3 damage is a great deal. Gets some bonus points for also being able to dome the opponent when that is necessary. I'm giving it a B. Next we have Onake Ogre, which for 2 generic and a red is a 4/2 Ogre Warrior with no other text. Another creature with some pretty mediocre stats, but this does hit hard for a 3-drop. There are also a handful of cards in the set that care about 4 power. They're in red and green specifically, and he gets you there pretty efficiently. I don't see myself playing this, though, unless things didn't go very well in my draft, where I have a few cards that care about 4 power, and for that reason I'm giving it a D+. Next we have Sarkon Fireblood, who for 1 generic and 2 red is a Planeswalker, Sarkon at Mythic Rare. It comes into play with 3 loyalty. It has a +1 ability that says you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So rummaging again. The other +1 is add 2 mana in any combination of colors. Spend this mana only to cast dragon spells. And the -7 creates 4 5/5 red dragon creature tokens with flying. This is a super underwhelming Planeswalker. Sure, he costs 3, which is super low, but this guy is more Tibalt than Liliana. The first +1 isn't bad. Rummaging is a nice effect in Limited. The second one could also come in handy, provided you have a few dragons. And his ultimate is the kind that wins the game. And his additional +1 to add 2 manas of any color, I could see being especially useful in a red deck that happens to be splashing one of the Elder Dragons, because he's pretty good for that, for that effect, because he's a source of fixing only for dragons. But that's one of the places I could see running him and being pretty happy about it. But he still comes with no real card advantage engine, no removal, and no way to protect himself. And those things all amount to make him a serviceable card for most red decks, but not much more than that. If you don't have any dragons, it's basically a glorified rummaging goblin that might threaten to make some dragons later, but because he can't protect himself, it seems unlikely that he gets there. Don't be tricked by the rarity and sweet card type here. This is far from a first pickable card. It's just a C. Next, we have Sarkon's Unsealing, which for 3 generic and a red is an enchantment at rare. It says whenever you cast a creature spell with power 4, 5, or 6, Sarkon's Unsealing deals 4 damage to any target. It also says whenever you cast a creature with power 7 or greater, Sarkon's Unsealing deals 4 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control. This might be my favorite card in the set, and it is one I'm going to try to build around a few times and probably end up regretting. But up front, you get a 4-mana enchantment that doesn't do anything. If you can build around this by playing some big creatures, like our friend Onake Ogre, this does get to be insane. Doing 4 to any target is super powerful. What's more is, if you manage to play a 7-power creature, it just annihilates your opponent's board. How easy is it to build around this? Well, it's not super easy. You probably want to be a ramp deck of some kind, but there are a few creatures around that are well suited for it that don't cost 1,000,000 mana. Stuff like Onake Ogre, Havoc Devils, and so forth. The value you can unseal here is pretty nuts if you can pull it off. That said, your average limited deck just isn't going to have enough 4, 5s, and 6s, so I think this is probably an F in your typical limited deck. But I think if you can really get there and building around this, it's at least a B. I mean, if you just kill 2 creatures with this, you probably feel like you got there. Doing anything more than that will just be insane. Next, we have Shock, which is 1 red mana for a common instant, and it deals 2 damage to any target. We see this all the time. There's a lot of removal in this set for red. This is another good one as it can kill most early creatures, and because it only costs a single mana, it will basically always help you trade up. It isn't quite as good as Lightning Strike, but it is still a first pickable red removal spell, and a B-. Next we have Siegebreaker Giant, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 6/3 giant warrior at uncommon. It has trample, and for 3 generic and a red, it can make target creature unable to block this turn. A 5-mana 6/3 is another creature that could be good with Sarkon's Unsealing, by the way, but on its own, this is pretty good too. A 6/3 Trampler for 5 would probably be like a C, but this can make things unable to block, and that's a nice ability. Oftentimes, making your opponent's best blocker unable to do so just really opens the floodgates and allows your whole board to go crazy, and this can enable that. Your opponent really has to respect this once it's in play and try to leave enough creatures back that you can't just kill them. I think he's a nice pickup for any red deck, whether at the top of the curve or a really aggressive one, or a big creature to try to win a game with in a more controlling deck. I'm going to give him a C+. Next, we have Smelt, which for 1 red mana is an instant at common, and it says destroy target artifact. Obviously, this is a sideboard card. This set is nowhere near dense enough in artifacts that you ever want to mainboard it. And I think that means it's an F, like as a mainboard card, just don't do it. However, it does blow them up really efficiently. Unless your opponent plays a couple of targets for this, though, you probably shouldn't even bother siding it in. Once they do have the required targets, I think it gets better, but it's still probably only like a C- as a sideboard card. Next, we have Spark-Tongue Dragon, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a common dragon. It's a 3/3, has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you can pay 2 generic and a red, and when you do, it deals 3 damage to any target. So this card sort of has kicker, and I think the feel of playing it will be pretty familiar if you're just drafting Dominaria. Basically, you either get a 5-mana 3/3 flyer, acceptable but not great, or an 8-mana 3/3 flyer that casts Lightning Bolt. It is doubtful that this format is quite as grindy as Dominaria was. I could see this being like a B- if this were in Dominaria. In this format, though, I think it's probably like a C+. Next, we have Spit Flame, which for 2 generic and a red is a rare instant. It does 4 damage to target creature, and whenever a dragon enters the battlefield under your control, you can pay red, and if you do, you return it from your graveyard to your hand. So the floor on this is a really good card already, Bombard basically, which we saw recently. The ceiling is that you can just keep on bringing it back if you have dragons. Even if you have like 3 dragons in your deck, this gets way better. This thing having a fail case of being a premium removal spell and a ceiling of being a recurring one gets this a B in a deck with 0 dragons, and a straight up A in a deck with a few of them. Next we have Sure Strike, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. Target creature gets +3/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. This is always a serviceable combat trick that basically wins you any combat. In exchange, it isn't the kind of trick that can save your creature from removal. You'll play this in your aggressive red decks, but not really anywhere else. I'm giving it a C-. Next, we have Tectonic Rift, which for 3 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It says destroy target land. Creatures without flying can't block this turn. This card is mostly playable for the second sentence on it. Blowing up lands and limited is irrelevant like 99% of the time, but making your opponent's creatures unable to block is nice. That's a good way to end the game. Really aggressive decks will love this card because it will allow them to bust through for the last few damage once the opponent has seemingly stabilized. Still, you have to already have a good board presence for it to be good, and there are going to be times where it just isn't worth casting and rots in your hand. I'm going to give it a C-. I see myself playing it sometimes in aggressive decks, but that's about it. Next we have Thud, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, you have to sacrifice a creature. It deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to any target. This is a cheap, efficient removal spell, but it does ask for a pretty big sacrifice in the form of one of your creatures, and you can't just give up some creature token here, because if you do that, you're basically getting no value, because doing 1 to something just isn't worth it. So this is usually going to 2 for 1U, unless you use something like Active Aggression, which would be pretty disgusting. This can also target your opponent too, so keep that in mind. Sometimes it can just kill you out of nowhere. Generally, I feel like this is going to be hard to make work. You need a creature that replaces itself somehow, or has a good death effect, or to steal an opponent's creature to get the full value. But still, this could conceivably end games or kill your opponent's best creature for only a single mana. It's kind of hard to evaluate, sort of like Fling, but Fling being an instant sort of alters it altogether, since you can sacrifice it response to removal, in which case you know you're getting value. You can't do that here because it's a sorcery. I'm going to start this at C. It is a difficult to use removal and finisher, and I'll leave it at that for now. Next we have Tormenting Voice, which for 1 generic and a red is a common sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, you discard a card, and then you draw 2 cards. This is the kind of card that ends up being your 23rd card in red a lot of the time. That's what it's been every time we've seen it. It helps you dig through your deck, but with a fairly significant cost. Sure, it gets a little better in the blue-red deck, which cares about spells, but not by a lot. This is the kind of card that barely misses the cut or barely makes the cut all the time. Remember that if you are running one of these, you should almost always be trying to hang on to extra lands so you don't have to discard something that you actually don't want to discard. Overall, I think this is a C-. Next we have Trumpet Blast, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant, and it says attacking creatures get +2/+0 until end of turn. I don't like this sort of effect a whole lot. It doesn't pump toughness at all, so you basically have to set up an Alpha Strike that kills your opponent for it to work out. Unlike other spells that also pump creature toughness and can get you some advantages in combat. Basically, this will only be playable in a deck where you can go really, really wide on your opponent and it's an F everywhere else. So I think it's probably like a C in a really good go wide deck. Next we have Dismissive Pyromancer, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 Dismissive Wizard at common. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. I've said this about several cards in the set. This is a 2-drop that is relevant even late, maybe to a lesser extent than some of the others I've said it about, since 2 damage isn't exactly going to have a huge effect, but it can sometimes. And when it comes with decent stats for 2 mana, I think most red decks will feel fine about having a couple of these as 2-drops. I'm giving it a C. Next we have Volcanic Dragon, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 dragon at uncommon with flying and haste. This has been a rare in the past, so it's been downshifted, basically due to creature power creep. It feels right to be uncommon, I think, for what it is. 6 mana for a 4/4 with flying and haste is a good deal. Not the most interesting card to talk about. It's just some good stats and keyword abilities that quickly pressure your opponent, and I think that makes it a B-, making it first pickable in some weaker packs. And our final card is Volley Veteran, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/2 Goblin Warrior at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, it deals damage to target creature an opponent controls equal to the number of goblins you control. So this is obviously a build around, though I do think it's playable on its own as a 4 mana 4/2 that does 1 damage to a creature. That's probably like a C-. However, as mentioned earlier, there are 5 goblins at common and uncommon in this set, and if you can pick up a few of those, this can turn into Flame Tongue Kavu. Sure, the set isn't incredibly well supported for goblins, but there are enough that doing 2 or 3 with this isn't too hard. I actually like the idea of first picking this in weaker packs and taking it early in general, because it has a floor that, while not spectacular, is acceptable, and I think it has an incredible ceiling. I think it's a solid B in a deck that manages to get 7 or more goblins. So that's the last red card in Core Set 2019. Tomorrow I'll be back to talk about all of the green cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. Make sure you subscribe for additional Core Set 2019 limited content, including draft videos in a few weeks. Thanks for watching.